this week we're going to have a little preview, look ahead to how we think it's going to pan out, and eventually get off the fence once more and give our predictions. Well, I'm a lot less confident on this one than I was on Chris Eubank and Liam Williams, but we'll see how we get on anyway.
Good stuff, absolutely. The launch of DAZN's UK schedule for 2022. So looking forward to it. I think, as I said on Twitter, probably by the time I'm going to resubscribe, I think, and get stuck into it again. And I think it's Alexandra Palace Friday night as well. Is it Friday night? Or is it Saturday night?
Is it Saturday? I forgot. Experts here.
Saturday. I've just been tweeting about another show that's on Saturday, on a Friday. So yeah, it is Saturday as well. I'm getting tickets. But no. Looking forward to it. Intriguing fight. And the last chance to move fight as well, both guys. So a lot on the line, really.
Nice and slick and professional there. Not knowing what date it is, but we'll get started. I think, yeah, like just to reiterate a little bit what you've said already there, bit of last chance saloon, definitely just because of the sort of age of the two fighters. I think before it was made, it was one of those that you didn't ever really expect to be made. There's been a couple. I mean, Chris Jenkins and Julius Ndongo was one recently where you're sort of thinking, where's that come from? A bit of a curveball with the matchmaking. But this one almost seems like they've got two middleweights slash obviously now super middleweights that have been kicking about for a while. Neither of them really have any long term plan or long term goal as to where Matchroom are going to navigate them or where they're going to get them that big fight. And it's like, right, well, we've had this pandemic. We were sort of not pushed for dates necessarily, but if you want to fight, gone are the days of you getting a little late round tune up on an undercard somewhere. Like you've got to get in and earn your spot almost within Matchroom. And both men obviously have seized the opportunity. I think it's a bigger opportunity, a bigger chance for John Ryder. There's more to lose if you're Daniel Jacobs coming over here and fighting Ryder, but I imagine he's been compensated very well financially to come over to London, and that'll obviously have played a part in his decision to come in what he, I imagine, thinks is going to come and get the win.
No, absolutely. Yeah, totally agree with what you said there. That is an intriguing element for me, is that it's pretty much like a role reversal in recent years. As I've done quite a lot, get a lot of British and Irish fighters who, especially since the launch of Matchroom USA and DAZN, have gone over there and not always came back with the results, apart from like the truly world class guys, and your Josh Taylors and your Fuse and stuff. You don't have the best record, but this is an intriguing one that Jacobs is coming to London, and like you said there, it's the fight that nobody really did see coming or really asked for. But now it's made, it makes all the sense in the world. Both guys, I like this total last chance to win it. If any of them do have like world ambitions, and I just think it's interesting because just to see what both of them have left, like just we'll touch on it again in a bit more detail in a bit, but both coming in with question marks really. Question marks over both of them just to see exactly what level they're at and what level, a win here would push them on to. But so we take it one by one. I asked you this on our show the other week when we were previewing a lot of fights, but John Ryder, I think you made the point, Andrew, that it was 2019 that he fought Callum Smith. And he's done very little since really got the tune up guys, and that's the question that we'll answer. Is he living off that sort of performance and those glories, or can he replicate that again on Saturday night? That's the thing about him.
I think, yeah, like you've mentioned that fight there, and it seems bizarre that like a Callum Smith loss is possibly John Ryder's biggest win, just because of how many saw that fight going. And I think officially, obviously on the cards, he did lose, and that has maybe seen him not spiral necessarily, but not get the crack and the big fight that he really craved following that. I think if he'd got the win, there's every chance he'd have been the one fighting Canelo, getting the potential seven-figure purse and genuinely life-changing opportunity, whether he won or lost that fight. But because of not getting that nod, it's then put him in a position where other big names are probably thinking twice about facing him because they know what sort of performance he can put in. But then he doesn't really have the name value of a, not necessarily, not saying he's not a credible opponent, but in terms of getting the reward and the for the risk he presents, the reward of beating him isn't necessarily that great because he does have losses on his record. I think all of them to domestic rivals, not necessarily at that domestic British level, but on the way up, he's always been in tough fights. He's never taken the easy route. He's lost some very close decisions to very good fighters. And I think if you were just to look at his record and think, oh, 30 wins or whatever it is, the five losses, is he in the league of Daniel Jacobs, who's mixed it with Canelo? He's generally been at the top of the division. Like I think you tweeted something earlier about like his only losses are to the sort of, elite top level fighters, and it's whether he's declined to the point where Ryder has now surpassed him. Obviously, that's what we're going to find out on Saturday night. I like how you said that's what we're going to decide and sort of and call here. I really struggle to do that. I don't know what we're looking at with both of these fighters. I mean, they're both not the most active recently. If you look at, as I say, like, you're going back 2 or 3 years, aren't you, to where we're trying to gauge where they were rather than like, necessarily where they are. I think it's fascinating from that regard because we say like, we think it's evenly matched, it's very close on paper, and there are a lot of unanswered questions going into it which adds to the intrigue, that adds to the sort of the discovery of what you're going to watch and what you're going to see when they step into the ring and face each other.
No, absolutely, and that's where the intrigue comes from the fight. I think it's like you touched on there that the sort of chasms between the caliber of opponents that we remember is just like it's night and day, really. But that's the crossroads aspect of it is who's going to catch you at a good time. Yeah, it's like like I tweeted earlier today, Golovkin, Canelo, who are James only three lost good wins on there, like Vichenko and fighters like that. Just in it's just the caliber is just like worlds apart. But the intrigue is, and I think the doubts of Jacobs basically came from his last fight against Gabriel where he wasn't really very good, and that's the crux of it really. Whether that is the bump in the road of an off night, or is it going to really start a noticeable decline? Like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, Jacobs Ryder, just Jacobs all day long, just levels, you would have thought, but that's where the doubts come this time. It's like, was that last fight for Jacobs the start of something, start of down the slope? Factoring in what he's been through, personal life, illness and stuff like that, is a lot of miles on that clock. But that's the intrigue, and that's where it's fascinating to come over here. It's not like Ryder's going there, and you feel Jacobs more, but to come over here, he isn't his favourite, but it's such intriguing, very intriguing.
I think psychologically as much as physically as well. Like, yeah, he's had a long career. He's had a tough life, a tough career, and a tough few years. But I think psychologically, if he's one of these boxers, as we're led to believe, that's been earning very well out of the Matchroom USA thing and the DAZN side of things over there, rumours of what Devin Haney's been earning, Mikey Garcia got paid for like a one-off fight and stuff. You'd imagine like Jacobs is one of those sort of bigger names that they've had and that they've promoted over the course of a couple of years now. So you imagine he is on a decent amount of money, and as I say, I think he must have to be to sort of take this high risk fight because we're talking about the winner potentially going on to world honours, and I think from a rider point of view, that's definitely the case. If he gets the win over Jacobs, he's then pushed himself up a level and put himself right in the mix of the 168-pound division. Whereas if Jacobs beats Ryder, it's not necessarily any better than some of his previous wins that you've mentioned. So it's it's a crossroads fight in one sense, in one regard, but for Jacobs, it's almost like if we're going back to that, as we said, the Jacobs were a couple of years ago, it's a routine win. Like if this was again in the States, like you said, like there'd be a whole, I think for me anyway, a whole different shift on it. It would be the latest in the long line of plucky Brits going abroad and challenging a big name, getting a decent payday out of it, but ultimately sort of going in over their head. Whereas just the geography of it totally changes your perception of the fight. And you think, okay, is this now Matchroom backing Ryder a little bit and giving him that almost reward for the Callum Smith performance? And he's not just sort of making up the numbers on cards. And been a bit of a name at that lower sort of level. He's now being given a really good opportunity almost on his doorstep, hopefully with that sort of push behind him. And for his point of view, for his sake, I'd love to see him do it. I think tactically, technically, from like the fight point of view, Ryder has got to come out and put it on Jacobs from the very first bell. If you look back at obviously Williams and Eubank, there's definitely similarities there. That Ryder in the Williams role, you'd expect him to come out and be aggressive and take a couple of shots to land his own. But from his point of view, if he can get in on the chest of Jacobs and not give him time to settle, not allow him to get into that rhythm that he wants to do and get his boxing going and get the jab going and sort of build from there, Ryder can make it an uncomfortable 12 rounds for anyone, and I definitely include Danny Jacobs in that.
I'm fascinated to see what attitude Dan Jacobs comes over with, just because, like you say, if this was 2 years ago, your house would be on Danny Jacobs. You know what I mean? And he's sure he has that belief just because of the people he's beat him with, and like it would be some, you know, statement that John Ryder's really poor person to beat him, and you join some illustrious company there if you just beat him, and I'm sure that Jacobs is still confident that if he wants to get back to world level from his point of view, like world title level, he has to be beating John Ryder, whether that's in London, New York, wherever it is. But that's the bit where I'm fascinated by because there's he's favourite, like I said. I think Sky Bet had him 8 to 11, and if that was, I would keep saying a couple of years ago, if someone gave you 8 to 11 for Dan Jacobs, John Ryder, you'd snap your hand off for it. However, at the end of that is it's the London thing. It's his last fight. Is he washed? Is he shocked? I don't know. We don't know. We'll only find out on Saturday. But I think one thing I'm relatively confident in is that the fight will go the distance. I'd be very surprised that if either man gets the other out of there. Jacobs is massively known for his power. John Ryder can dig and can bang, but I think it would be some statement if he can stop Jacobs. Jacobs might have to be especially shocked to be getting put out in that way. So I can't see it going the full 12 rounds, and it's just it's picking that winner. I think I'm still not yet off the fence, but I will have to get off it by the end of this. But just really intrigued by it. Good fight.
Yeah, without discrediting John Ryder too much ahead of time, I think if he does stop him, if he gets the stoppage win, that might be a bit more of an indication of just how far Jacobs has declined.
Yeah.
It could go that way in the sense of if he comes out and he's completely shot, he's got absolutely nothing left, his reflexes have gone, his resistance is then gone. I think Ryder could get him out of there fairly early if he's like, aggressive enough and puts it on him. And as I say, if Jacobs has got next to nothing left, if Jacobs is at 70, 80% of what he was, then I probably envisage it being a very competitive fight, but like you said, last in the distance. Just because Jacobs seems crafty enough to go that way. I know obviously his first loss against Pirog, he was spot pretty much clean out, but he's since obviously lost to two of the best, I don't want to say best ever, if you want to call that far in terms of the middleweight division and obviously super middleweight now. I think just in terms of an experience point of view, skill set point of view, Jacobs has definitely got enough, even if he's not quite what he once was, to potentially eke out a decision, but certainly negate Ryder enough that he's not going to get embarrassed unless, as I say, unless everything we've just talked about it has completely gone and deteriorated a lot more than we've seen even in the previous fight against Rosado.
I do think there's more on the line here for Jacob probably than there is Ryder because I think Ryder's mixed with so many domestic opponents now that he can easily fall back to that level, and I'm sure Matthew will find a whole ton of opponents for him. Whereas I think Jacobs has that more standout CV mixed in with some being in there, like you said, with Canelo and Golovkin, just is and then to lose against John Ryder would be a bit where, that's his world level dreams gone. It would be a disaster for him, I think, right? Maybe less so, although he does obviously have world ambitions of his own. And it doesn't fight a John Ryder, he's meant to look better. He has got losses on there. Like, it feels like a long, long time ago that I watched him on Fox Nation against Joe Saunders, like a long time ago. And Blackwell losses are on there. It feels to me Blackwell's been out of the ring for a long time as well. So Miles on Ryder's spot, I'm not sure because he's done very little since the Callum Smith fight. He went over the space. I think he boxed Mike Guy on Golovkin's undercard. Pretty much toy with him. Never looked like getting him out of there, but yeah. And there's another few upsets. There was Jacobs just coming in straight from that sort of fight, that lackluster performance last year. Interested to see who's had a good camp, who's had a better camp, who's in better shape on the night, and see what both guys have got. I think, as I keep saying, um, just caliber, opponent wise, and experience wise, I still probably have to favour Jacobs at this stage. I would, and I just is that first there that Jacobs win that I mentioned. Is that just too good to look past? You know what I mean? If you were putting a bet on it or you were making a prediction, can you pass up 8 to 11 for Jacobs to beat John Ryder? Don't. It's hard, isn't it? Anything lower than that, I probably wouldn't touch. But I don't know. I think you might have to side with him, and that is probably the way I'm going at this stage. Is Jacob points prove that he's got something left? But it's tough because I'm seeing an argument for it.
Yeah, I think the longer we've been talking about it, and as you were sort of leaning more towards Jacobs, I feel like I've talked myself into that. Like Ryder's going to have that bit more desire, and or we know that doesn't always translate to anything really. Like you've got two boxers, I always tend to go for the skill and the guy who I generally think is the better boxer, and in that regard, I would say Daniel Jacobs, but. I don't know if it's the Rosado fight or even the Canelo performance. Like, there's obviously no shame whatsoever in losing to Canelo, but Jacobs almost boxed within himself at points of that as well, and not necessarily was happy to lose, but just happy to sort of go the distance. And you think we talk about fighters coming out of the ring and having regrets. Like, did he regret not giving it more of a go and trying to disrupt him and potentially get the win, or do you look at the windfall that you get from that sort of fight and you move on, and as I say, the Rosado fight was a very flat performance. Is that again one he's expected completely to win? Is he coming into this with a similar mentality? Is he thinking that he is levels above Ryder for all the reasons we've discussed? If there's any sort of complacency whatsoever, John Ryder is not the person you want to be staring across the ring at because he's not going to give you an easy night. We talk about miles on the clock and the losses he's had. None of those losses have been particularly comprehensive. Like, I know he's lost unanimous decisions to several opponents, but like the Jack Arnfield fight, for example, was razor thin. Even though every scorecard went to Arnfield, there wasn't a lot in that fight in terms of the rounds. Yes, they're tough fights. If you go on the distance in close fights, by definition, they're going to take a little bit out of you. But he's never really been on the end of a sustained beating or anything like that. The inactivity might affect him, but you can argue that for both men coming into this, and they're both past what we normally refer to as a peak. I think Ryder's probably closer to his peak than Jacobs. It's just how high his peak is and where Jacobs currently is at. Obviously, we are predicting a fight that's in 2022. We can't keep harping back to the good old days of 2018, 2019, but I think it's definitely going to be a close fight. And if I was going really detailed, I would say that it could end up being a split decision or a majority decision. With that in mind, you then look at the sort of the value in the draw and try and cover yourself that way. Like obviously looking at fight to go the distance, I think that's the way we're both sort of leaning. If I had to force myself to pick, I think Jacobs will probably have just enough to edge it. I'm talking again like razor thin, sort of 115, 113 type card, 7 rounds to five, maybe 8-4. I hate factoring in the judges and where the fight is in a decision and in a prediction, especially because it shouldn't matter, but we all know that it does. Is this potentially where John Ryder is going to get the rub of the green that he hasn't had so far in his career, like being on the end of some close losses? If he's the aggressive come forward fighter, are the judges going to favour that a bit more in the rounds where potentially there's not a lot between them? I'm not saying I think Jacobs is going to come and box on the back foot by any means. He's not going to be sort of scared to engage at all. But is Ryder then potentially going to edge it in that regard? I think if obviously we are making our predictions, and I'm actually going to agree with you for once. I think Jacobs on points is probably the more likely of the outcomes, unless of course he's down to sort of 10%, 15% of what he was compared to the sort of 75, 80 range we sort of think he is. I don't know what we're really basing that on, but I think, yeah, Jacobs points if I have to pick, and obviously we do.
I think it's just what you going back to something you mentioned earlier. I think it's a very good like inter-company, inter-matchroom fight, and I think they can't really lose here. Do you know what I mean? Matchroom can't really lose. Whoever wins it, they'll have plans for, and I think Jacobs is taking back to his big name over in the states. With who's beating him, as I keep mentioning, and like John Ryder wins, then you're rubbing your hands for maybe a big night in London or something, or putting John Ryder back over the stage, which he has experience in anyway. And you said you can't call back to like 2018, 2019, but in a way we have no choice because both men have done like very little since those big nights. And like John Ryder 2019 as Tom Smith, and just 2020, 2021 was pretty much a write off. You know what I mean? You're like two tune ups, and it all comes down to this really massive nights for both guys. Uh, it is in London for whatever reason they decided to do it up here, not the States. I don't think that's necessarily matching back in John Ryder and Tony Sims or whatever. You know what I mean? I just think that's like they must have the reasons for doing it. I'm sure they'll touch on it, but you've got atmosphere down there in the Alley as well. But you want boxing, I think. I don't recall many events there, but obviously a venue that I'm sure have big familiarity with the Dawson stuff. So
Yeah, I think Tony Bellew fought there a few years ago. I might be wrong with that one. I'm sure I remember watching him on Sky, and they were sort of talking about the same links with the darts and stuff. Um, I don't I don't know whether it is a sign that Matchroom are backing John Ryder and that they've got it over London, or if they're just consciously making that little shift away from the States, and they've got sort of UK dates to fill. Obviously, DAZN seem to be making pretty big plans, whether they're coming to fruition or not, like regards to Europe and the UK and this side of the pond. But I do think it just definitely shifts the perspective of the fight a little bit. I think if I were to commit and say which one Matchroom would prefer to win, I think they'd personally be quite happy for Ryder too, like on a personal level. Whether that makes more business sense or not, I don't know. I think when we talk about these intra promotional fights, like within Matchroom, these in house fights, I think it's a lot easier to make this sort of fight for them when both lads have got losses on the record and they're that little bit older. They're sort of more, I don't want to say desperate, but maybe more willing just to roll the dice and think, yeah, I'll get him with Daniel Jacobs, or Daniel Jacobs, yeah, I'll come over and fight John Ryder. It's not like the sort of pushing this undefeated prospect against a tough fighter like John Ryder. Like, there's a lot more to lose for Matchroom, I think, in moving these prospects too quickly and risking their undefeated records, risking the momentum that they're building. Whereas with these two, without this sort of fight, it's probably going to be quite hard to get them a good run of opponents and a good run of wins. Like they need to do something to propel themselves back into the mix. They're not going to do that just as I say, winning these 8 round tune ups or like a little knockover job here and there, or supporting an undercard. So it's like right, like we the promoter are a bit more in charge here. Like you need to fight this guy, or we strongly recommend you fight this guy, or we don't really have any options for you short term.
makes sense. It just really makes sense. Like obviously Jacob's point of view, he's probably thinking like John Ryder, like he's not Canelo, he's not Golovkin, like in London, awesome fighter, well paid for that. That'll be safe. John Ryder, again, like you say, it's nothing's going to be handed to John Ryder now. He has to do it, and he'll probably be thinking like Jacob's right, I'll give that a go, and so it makes sense. And I'm sure both lads are like pretty like expert and believe they can both win. And I am looking forward to a good fight in that one. I will. It's funny because my own like psychic mind, like head, is doing the opposite now. It's what I did last week. Like I was expecting to believe when he was praised that point, right? He'll come out like you said. You think John Ryder will put it on and go for it that way. And now I'm thinking, is that just me being good with myself? Thinking, well, should have back the more technical horse for the better. But you know what I mean. But the initial thought when I seen that fight was I like the odds on John Ryder. just, you know, I feel like in the last couple of days, when I've really sat down and think about it, I think I'm willing at this stage to give Jacobs the benefit of the doubt, brush off that solo fight and assume that, like you said, he's probably got 75%, 80% of what he had. Then that, to me, should still be good enough to beat John Ryder. So I'm going to go Jacobs by two. So if anyone's watching this and if you agree with that, I'm going to go Ryder.
Yeah, the fact we both did Jacobs, I think that's a bigger push for John Ryder. It'll sway the odds more than anyone lumping on any money, I think. Um,
Any other card you want to touch on? Just discussing before we came on there, it's not the best, let's be honest. Again, we've got a guy that we both know quite well on this, from the northeast. Always good to watch northeast. Well, sometimes it's good to watch northeast lads on the national stage.
yeah, we'll move on that back. But
But
I think go on.
so Felix Cash has got a ranking style fight. I think he'll be, someone he should beat well. I think Felix Cash. That's Johnny Fisher, local lad. I think so. I don't think it's down that way. Pretty much it, isn't it?
Yeah, Felix Cash was the one who caught my eye again. Obviously, apart from Cyrus, on a personal note, I think Cash is probably one of the most exciting prospects we've got in the UK at the minute. Um, seems to
Believe it.
seems to have a bit of everything. He's obviously a decent, very decent amateur pedigree, and he's got a bit of spite about him, a bit of power. Looks a bit of a nasty bastard in there at times, which is always nice in a fighter. Pretty good quality to have, I imagine, if you're working with someone in the gym trying to harness that. He's definitely destined for bigger things, and obviously he's making his way through. He had a good win, didn't he, against was it Denzel Bentley? Like
Yeah,
it seems like ages ago, but I don't think that was that long ago. Um,
but
he's one I imagine they're going to be sort of getting in European level. I've seen his name floating around with potential matchups with likes of Anthony Fowler, who's just gone up to middleweight. Liam Williams, who obviously sort of going to be in a bit of no man's land at the minute. Does he want to drop down and again, like what we've just talked about there, like almost be fed to the prospect and be in that position where Matchroom got like obviously they don't promote Williams, but they're going to be very heavily wanting Felix Cash to win that sort of fight, regardless of who it's against. I dare say, from a promotional point, if they did put him in with Fowler, then they'd be wanting him to win that as well. So all of this talk is obviously irrelevant if he doesn't get the job done this weekend, but I imagine he will. Imagine he'll look good doing it again and move on. And he's one, hopefully, he'll be a lot more active in 2022, get the dates, get the progression, build a bit of momentum, and could definitely be fighting for a world title within 18 months or so.
yeah, I agree with everything you said. It's a fighter that I really like as well. I wasn't sure at one point whether he had that spice, and I think spice the key word because it's really good to see when a fighter does have it, and he is showing that now. He's looking like a proper fearsome middleweight, and I think they also going to be moving him towards titles and rankings and stuff like that. I fully expect him to win well on Saturday, so that is someone I'm looking forward to watching. Ellie Scotney is a fighter that is people seem to really, really rate. And I think she's in a decent fight. I think on Saturday. Looking forward to watching her just to see. I haven't really seen a load of her, but just to see what the sort of the hype is about as well. So not bad. I'm looking forward to it though. Main event more than anything. Looking forward to again another Saturday night game watching it and good to have her back, man. It's good just getting the teeth into things again. It's cracking.
Yeah, I echo that sentiment entirely. Like you think, obviously, back to like last weekend, boxing's got up and running. Like this weekend, just gone. We've got another main event where we are genuinely struggling to pick a winner at a very decent level as well. Again, sort of within that fringe world level, probably a similar level to Eubank Williams in that regard. Maybe even higher, depending on sort of how highly you rate John Ryder post Callum Smith, how highly you rate Jacobs on like his body of work. But another like potentially very competitive main event where you sat on the fence and you've got to really sort of unpick it to try and pick a winner. Like, I'd much rather these than some of the one-sided mismatches we've seen over the years, and just putting like a name in with an opponent in a sort of very routine title defense or what have you. And like, how refreshing is it? How nice is it that we've got this? And I think even with Matchroom singing their praises, like you look back to the Fowler and Smith fight, that was another one where it wasn't necessarily a fight that people have been clamoring for. It seemed to come a bit out of the blue, like this one. But once it's been made, it's like, oh, actually, like there's like we said right at the start, there are a lot of questions potentially that could be answered when they get in together, and it's one I'm really looking forward to, and hopefully whether it's the COVID-19 pandemic, everything that's gone on in the last couple of years is forcing the promoters' hands a little bit in that regard, that the fighters are going to have to get in, and to sort of paraphrase the old fight camp mantra of like no easy fights.
Yeah, yeah.
Hopefully that does get pushed, and we're not saying like obviously we don't want these fighters in impossible situations and not making anything out of it. Like hopefully they're both getting paid very well, and they're getting rewarded for the risk they're taking, because it is a risky fight for both men. And you can say the same about, as I say, last weekend with Eubank and Williams, and obviously this one coming up. There's a whole host of fights where you're sort of looking, thinking, okay, it's not as clear cut as you'd imagine, or as we maybe previously been used to. Getting a little bit spoiled, and it feels good.
No, absolutely. I think it carries the card, the headline fight. And I think if that was just John Ryder against just another name, like just a random and sort of world ranking fighter, eliminate against someone we weren't familiar with, I think that shoe would have got absolutely pelters for all the UK schedule of that. But because it's a real credible sort of world tier, world ranked opponent in Danny Jacobs, and it's all good and there's good. You know, a lot on the line for both guys, good questions need to be answered. So look forward to finding out those answers on Saturday night. I'm sure. Jacobs points.
Agree. We'll agree to leave it there. I think we both concur on a result and a prediction. It's probably the first time in the 7 years we've been doing BBB. So I think it's a good a note as any to end it. Once again, just like to thank everyone that's watched, everyone that's listened, either Twitter, YouTube, clicked a like, dropped a comment, interacted with us in any way over the sort of the fight weekend and this fight week coming forward. Like we really appreciate it. We're both a little taken back. I think video we did got over 1,000 views. Small fry to a lot of people. We appreciate that, but like to us, it's quite significant, and a nice little reward for this sort of revamped, refreshed YouTube push that we've started beginning of 2022.
Totally agree. Yeah, thank you very much. Anyone that shares or subscribes, likes it, leaves a comment on the channel, really appreciate it. Got plenty more stuff coming up as well. So